Okay, I think I can begin there. Welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us for what I think will be an interesting 1-hour discussion on mainstreaming gender in the teaching of journalism and communications. My name is Alan Finley. Our guests, whom I will introduce in a moment, are from Africa and Southeast Asia. So we have a really nice intercontinental panel with us today with experts working in the area of gender or gender and the media. The purpose of this webinar is to raise awareness of a teaching resource that UNESCO has developed called Gender, Media and ICT's New Approaches for Research, Education and Training. I've placed a link to the publication in the chat box for you to download. I've also placed a related resource called Reporting on Violence Against Women and Girls, a handbook for journalists, which I'm sure you will find equally useful. The Gender, Media and ICT's publication is designed for university classes. It offers a model curricula that can be used as an entire resource, or parts of it can be used to suit the particular needs of ICT and journalism students and teachers. The purpose of the training resource is to strengthen a gender perspective when teaching on the topics of ICTs and media. For example, it includes modules on representation, language and discourse, access to decision-making power, gender in media and ICT organizational structures, and advocacy and activism, amongst others. While offering ways to approach and understand each theme, it includes a useful set of references for the students and lecturers. We would like to encourage you to actively use the resource in your classroom. It is a valuable tool for both teaching and learning. This is the first of 3 webinars that we're holding aimed at discussing the UNESCO teaching resources in English and promoting the use in the classroom. On Thursday, at the same time, we have one on fake news and disinformation. And in the coming months, we'll be launching UNESCO's new resource called People on the Move, reporting on migrants and refugees, which, like this resource, will also be available in languages such as Arabic, French, Spanish, and Swahili. Today, to discuss the topic of gender and the media and the need to mainstream a gender perspective in journalism education, we have 4 guests. Nechama Brody, a lecturer in journalism at Wits Journalism in Johannesburg and author of the book Femicide in South Africa. Versant, the Director General of the Center for Media Studies in India. Emily Comfort Marakto, the Head of Department of Journalism and Media Studies and incoming Director of the Africa Policy Center at Uganda Christian University. And Shanette Dinam, a lecturer at the Faculty of Communication Arts at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok, and who is also on the Committee on the Determination of Unfair Gender Discrimination at Thailand's Ministry of Social Development and Human Security. And I must apologize to Shanette for having a somewhat outdated description of her position in the advert we sent out for this webinar. Welcome to all of you. Emily, if I may start with you. You have taught a course on media, gender and social justice at the master's level at Uganda Christian University. And now recently you managed to get this introduced at the undergraduate level. This sounds like an excellent achievement. In your experience, is the subject of gender often left out of journalism courses in Africa?
Thank you, Alan. And whatever the time is, I greet everyone in their time zones. Yes, you're right. We have been teaching gender, media, and social justice for our students. We introduced the course in 2014 for a master's group. And we thought that there was a need for it because of the nature of representation of women in media and the kind of gaps that we were seeing in media coverage of critical issues. So we introduced a course, and I have been teaching that particular course because I did my PhD in actually gender and media. So I was teaching that course, and we found that we needed the course at undergraduate level as well. In fact, we have taught journalism for the last 20 years, and we had not had the course taught for undergraduate students. But we realized that the students we teach at master's level are already in transition. They are going into management, they are going into other programs. They're actually maybe going out of media to do some other work. So it can't affect the people who are reporting on everyday basis. And we realized that maybe to have a greater impact, the course needs to be introduced at an undergraduate level. So while I was head of department, we had an opportunity to review our curriculum and the National Council for Higher Education approved the inclusion of gender in training. And the question you directly asked is whether gender is often left out of our curriculum in African universities. I can't speak for every African university because I don't know, but the ones I attended in both Nairobi and Durban in South Africa did not have gender in their curriculum. And I also know that as Uganda Media Women's Association, we've done studies on Ugandan curriculum and found that only 2 institutions actually taught gender at undergraduate level. And the problem is even bigger, that gender studies itself does not appear to include media as a major subject of study. So there's no intersection between gender and media. Media studies is hardly teaching it, and gender studies is hardly teaching media. So there's no very limited understanding. So our interaction with the industry, with those who are actually doing the media work, is that there's very limited understanding of the gender concept. So one of the things we really focus on is helping journalists to understand what these concepts of gender are. You may be surprised that some of the concepts in gender we take for granted are hardly understood by people who are in practice. And through our various engagements with journalists, we discovered that there was a huge gap, knowledge gap, in as far as understanding gender is concerned. A lot of the journalists will tell you that they don't have gender in their radar. It's not something they consciously think about. And so the journalism education and my years of training in journalism as well has taught me that we focus a lot on the how journalists should get the stories told, how they should hold their camera, how they should do this, but there's very limited content in as far as the subject matter is concerned. What are they going to write about? And how do they understand those things that they actually write about? And that's why I'm excited when I hear things about migration resources, covering migration, covering gender-based violence, because they are not intuitive to journalists. They get out of journalism schools when they actually know how to tell stories, but they don't know enough of what to tell.
Emily, can you tell me a little bit about the representation of women in the Uganda media, of course, in general, but in your experience, what is it lacking? I mean, when it comes to reporting on women, to talking about women?
Oh yeah. Fortunately, this was my subject area in my PhD dissertation. I did study representation of women in the Ugandan public affairs programming. So the representation varies. If you're talking about current affairs, you're talking about political matters, you're talking about the economy, the so-called hard subjects, then you have very limited representation of women in terms of voices, in content, in terms of sources, sources of news, as even writers, the people who are the reporters themselves, there are very limited women there. But if you're talking about entertainment in Uganda, for example, a lot of the entertainment programs are actually run by women, young women who are, so it is as if there's a binary. If you want more women in media, then you put them in entertainment. If you want to do the difficult things like news and political talk shows, public affairs in general, then you actually have fewer and fewer women. Because again, my research has shown that the general perception is that women don't have that many political viewpoints or important economic viewpoints. They don't have, they're not confident to talk about these things. And these are perceptions that have actually influenced the way that women are placed in news management, the way that editorial is managed, the way that media managers are promoted. So representation, depending on what we are looking at, is really, really varied. But again, if you're looking at portrayal, much of the work we have done is that there's very negative portrayal on women, especially women politicians. They are sort of treated very unfairly in terms of reporting. They're referred to by their husband's name. They're sort of not, they don't have their own identity in most cases. Their success is also belittled in so many ways because their contribution is not treated as important enough in society. So there are all those areas. In terms of representation, in terms of media management, maybe we have just a handful of media houses owned by women. So those are critical things, really.
Thank you. Shanette, if I may turn to you on a similar topic, how would you describe the representation of women in the media in Thailand? How gender sensitive is the media in that country?
Okay, thank you for question. I would like to go back to the history because the system of patriarchal ideology has been worked and dominated the media representation about Thai women for a long time. Yeah, when we talk about representation of women in Thai media, it started since the era of media industry influence in Thailand. There were newspapers and magazines in the absolute monarchy period since 1917, which was the booming era of Thai media industry. Examples of representations of women in media at the early stage are, for example, making women as causes of sexual assaults, blaming women as victims of sexual violence in the early days of media history, such as women were the causes of being raped because they did not dress properly, walk alone in desolate area, drank alcohol, or give consent to the rapists. During that time, it was seen that the story of rape was trivial and could be compromised. Thai media marks its values toward virgin and beauty of women. As a result, women are trapped in beauty products and endless consumption. Thai media define the meaning of being a mother and a good wife, causes limited choices for life for women during that time. Women who were outside the norm of marriage, such as a single woman, single mother, lesbian, and prostitute will be labeled as bad women. Women are also perceived with femininity. They have to stay home and no chance for education and occupation. During that time, domestic violence is often considered a personal problem, not social issue. So the struggle of Thai women at that time was seen of having the Western educated progressive women gather to launch a women magazine under the liberal feminism concept. It was the same period of the first wave of feminism battles in the Western. And I think this was the first wave feminism in Thailand to fight against the representation of women in media and was to call out for rights for women to study and work outside home. Let's go to the second wave of feminism in Thailand. It led by a group of students in the years of 1973 to 1976 during the call for democracy from the dictatorship government. Although some women had opportunity to study and have careers, they were still being reproduced in media as a sexual object and got wages lower than men. In this period, the representation of women was still seen as a sexual object through various product advertisements. Women were made to be viewed as the fanatic of beauty product consumption. However, the liberal struggle to destroy representation in the media of this time was successful in many ways. In particular, the Thai Constitution in 1974 provided for the first time that women and men have equal rights. In particular, the amendment to the Civil and Commercial Code on the family that is related to marriage, registration, property between husband and wife, divorce, and when in the past, women were at all disadvantaged. labor law, maternity leave rights, which is due to the rally of pregnant women workers to the government house of Chuan Lik Pai government, allowing women 90 days of maternity leave. In 2007, there were many advancements in legislation promoting women's rights, such as the amendment of Article 276 of the criminal law when a husband rapes his wife is illegal. The Domestic Violence Victim Protection Act has been passed. This is considered as a deconstruction breakthrough of domestic violence representation as a private matter from Thai society. The Issuance of Gender Equality Act in 2015 is a one-off breakthrough in having a mechanism to protect the rights of persons who are discriminated against their genders. The most important and powerful campaign to fight against media representation of the third wave in Thailand is hashtag Don't Tell Me How to Dress by Cindy Sirinya Bischoff, the Thai supermodel. She posted a clip about women's rights and dress appropriately during Songkran Day. It caused a hashtag phenomenon, hashtag Don't Tell Me How to Dress, and hashtag Tell Men to Respect, which have a share on Instagram by many famous people who have come out to support the ideas. And collaboration with the Women's and Men Progressive Movement Foundation to take a step forward in organizing an exhibition showing the clothes worn by women who have been raped to show that dressing is not the solution of sexual harassment. Another phenomenon is the campaign on the issue of sexual consent by Thai Consent Facebook fan page that opened the issue of sexual harassment in different levels of relationships and found that Thai society does not have sufficient awareness in sexual consent. Another important phenomenon in the third wave in Thailand is Femtweet. Femtweet come from feminism and Twitter. Hashtag Femtweet in Thailand is a major phenomenon created by young generation. This campaign is to raise awareness about the patriarchy, sexual harassment, opposition to rape culture, victim blaming, body shaming, a question about beauty privilege, and support an amendment of criminal law articles 301, giving women with safe alternatives to abortion. From the beginning of media industry in Thailand in 1917, I think how to destroy and resist against the representation in media of Thai women, I think we come so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Shanette. I mean, recently you commented on, you mentioned a lot about rape
Yes.
in the culture of Thailand, and recently you commented on rape, the representation of rape on Thai TV. I mean, tell us a bit about that. That was quite interesting. I mean, it was suggested that many soap operas, for example, they like to show or show rape or you know, in order to attract viewers. Is that, tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I asked myself how it is possible that media shows news of rape and something bad during the daytime, and soap operas can show the same situation as something romantic at night. Rape in Thai soap opera is a problem. It is routinely depicted as a precursor to romance, with a female protagonist shown falling in love with their rapist. Rape culture in Thai dramas has constructed the meaning of rape as righteousness by the meaning of rape as love, rape for teaching a bad woman, rape for revenge, rape for a virgin value. On-screen rape has never been equal to the pain of women in the real world. The effects of rape were never as fun as in the drama. Some of the women have been murdered, injured, disabled, unexpected pregnant, contracted sexually transmitted diseases, including HIV/AIDS. It easily risks to other diseases because the immune system of the women is low due to stress. Many female victims have reached the state of depressive disorder in Thailand. And yeah, this is a very serious problem. When rape is set in a TV series, the male-dominated capitalist trapped and turned the horror of media rape into just a form of entertainment to be sold in the capitalism. The TV series in Thailand rarely sees rape as a crime. It has never linked rape to a social problem level and point out that rape is an evil root of culture nurtured by capitalism, though the media industry. It sees rape only a romantic love. And yeah, in 2015, I worked with the NBCT, or National Broadcasting and Telecommunications Commission, which is the organization for media regulation in Thailand. And I wrote the first ethical guidelines for television programs. This stipulates the need to uphold the dignity of women, encourage directors to be cautious when depicting violence against women, advise against showing women as victims, and recommend that men's sexual responsibilities be addressed. Rape scenes, in my opinion, can be featured in the TV series, but it must be presented in the form of crime in which there is an offender and punishable by the juridical process. It should also point out that the rules of female rape come from the use of patriarchy power system, do not repeat reproduction in a society of the real world, that half of men who committed rape were never been penalized. And when looking at the picture that appear in the Thai TV series, almost all male characters were never been punished either. Right now, I think we quite successful to launch this campaign because of the power of fame tweet by young generation. Our voices has been heard by NBCT. And the last series, which named Mia Champen, from the Channel 3 television in Thailand, has been banned already, and they fined by the NBCT for 500,000 baht already.
Thank you, Jeanette. Vasanti, you've at the Center for Media Studies, you have monitored both news and entertainment. Now, Jeanette spoke about the representation of rape, the use of rape, and the misrepresentation of rape in soap operas. At the center, you see it as important both to monitor news content and entertainment programming. Why do you think it's important to look at entertainment too when we think of the media or of media content? So your mic, Vasanti, you're on mute.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Alan and UNESCO, for inviting me for this discussion. Certainly, entertainment and popular culture are so important, and thank you for raising that, both Emily and Jeanette, for raising this issue. We all know that in our society, we consume so much media, and most of it that we consume is entertainment, not news. Per se, at least in India, for example, I can really say that the news channels that all exist, and we have more than 400 of them, most people are ending up watching entertainment. In fact, the viewership of the news channels is less than 7%, which is really ridiculous because there are so many in number. But there are two things that are very important when we talk about entertainment. Actually, we do not realize it, but the way they influence norms and normalize much of our understanding of what is acceptable in a society. And I'm glad Jeanette talked about rape, because I think that's something that is very common in patriarchal society, where they show abuse and rape, violence, sexual violence of women, and then they show that the perpetrator being the hero or being rewarded in the end. And this has happened in Indian cinema, Indian serials also, and this is something that we fought against. And now thankfully, there is a protest and there is a movement against it, just like in Thailand. So it's very important that such blatant misuse or anti-constitutional, it's not even a gender issue, it's an anti-constitutional issue. So we need to really raise these issues and talk about it, especially in popular culture, where we feel that things get normalized, are normalized as acceptable in society, which certainly is not, especially for cases like sexual abuse or rape. So at CMS, and let me just give a little background about where I come from. I'm from a multidisciplinary research-based think tank. We work on a number of issues, including governance and education, health, environment, of course. We've been doing this for last 3 decades. This July, we will be almost 30 years old. Even though we do a lot of research and evaluations, and based on that, we do a lot of capacity building and advocacy initiatives, gender for us is really a cross-cutting and integrated into everything we do. We do look at our work from the gender lens. Now, specifically on gender, over the years, we've done a lot of studies and initiatives. In the last 2 decades, I think most of you know, media in India has grown tremendously, both in scale, size, business, and also impact, not only in India, but also elsewhere in the world. That too, across different languages, regions of our country. We have looked, when I say we, CMS has looked at how gender, specifically how women are playing a role both as representation, having a voice in this particular sector, and also their visibility and portrayal. And that's basically what we've been focusing on. And let me give you a little example of the study that we've recently done and done it for, at CMS Media Lab, we've been following these trends over the years. And we looked at how news media specifically, newspapers and television mainly, but also looking at advertising and popular culture like film songs, television serials, are also, what are the trends what are we seeing and how are they influencing or impacting us in terms of. So let me shift a little bit and talk a little bit about the recent study that we have done on safety of women journalists in our country. It was we all know about this issue, but we don't talk about it and we don't share about it. I have many media friends who have gone through such harassment but never actually talked about it. So this study was actually supported by UNESCO and gave a fantastic platform to actually document what was happening in India. And I'm sure this situation is very similar in other countries also. So we talked in this particular study, we were concerned about the threats and abuse, both especially online and against women journalists. So we did the study both online and in person last year, just before the COVID started, on the issue of online safety, especially from a gender angle. Clearly, the vulnerability of women media professional was highlighted for both physical, which was again mostly sexual in nature, and online, which was both abusive and threatening in nature. What was actually very scary and very alarming to me, at least, was that such harassment and abuse was taken as given. It was understood that if I'm getting into this sector, I will face it and I have to be prepared to face it and keep my mouth shut if I have to face it. And to be accepted to be part of the profession, in spite of which many of my respondents told me how that kind of harassment impacted them both psychologically and in their work, in their actual writings and in their presentation of news and whatever work that they're doing. In spite of that, people continue to be harassed. And that was something very scary for us and something that needed to be taken up seriously. So based on that particular study that we did a series of suggestions, and we took it forward as advocacy endeavors. For example, we created a manual for trainers on promoting online safety of women journalists in India. It's still not available on web, but it will be very soon. Developed a model curriculum on online safety and cybersecurity. we felt that online safety and cybersecurity is a relatively new area, especially for media students in Indian universities. In fact, we've created this curriculum on online safety and cybersecurity and and are right now advocating it to be adopted by universities across India. And also created a series of videos on various legal, technological, and psychological issues related to online safety of women journalists. So, and I'm currently working on creating model organizational policies for media companies to adopt to ensure safety of their journalists, both online and offline. So that's the kind of work we've been doing, and that's what we've been covering in terms of gender and media in India.
Santi, if I ask, in your experience, do these model editorial policies for media institutions work? Sometimes I get the impression that they, for instance, in Ethiopia, UN Women worked quite hard to get a model gender editorial guideline policy for public broadcasters, but many people said it just kind of gets shelved and once it's received. There's a bit of media, there's a bit of sort of public relations stuff happens, but then people forget about it. What is your sense? Are they effective to create these guidelines for media houses or public publications and so on?
And then I also felt the same when I started it. In fact, when I started talking to some of the media owners, which are very difficult to get, actually, they really kind of avoided me and didn't want to talk about such issues. Especially HR and organization policies are very closed. They're not open to public. They're not transparent in their thing. And you're very right. They're not very open to it. But I think like the UNESCO model curriculum or the UNESCO or such model guidelines are there for people who want to do something about it. We have already created a resource which is useful for people who are already sensitive about it. So suppose I, as a media owner, want to do something. Where do I go? Where do I start? I have to have some kind of a base document. And this guideline actually provides a fantastic resource. So we have to be ready for that. And this is also, this study that I mentioned earlier, actually provided a fantastic opportunity for both owners, editors, and journalists to actually talk about an issue that they really swept under the carpet. So when they started talking about it, they realized, okay, what can we do? How can we go about it? And then there was this ready-made model that we were giving them. That, look, here is a manual that actually tells you what you should be doing. What is your first resort? What is your legal resource? What can you do legally? What can you do with intermediaries? What can you do with government? What can you do at organization level? What can you do at peer level? What can you do with your friends and your families? And what can you do at individual level? So these kind of detailed, what can you do actionable points, both for the organization and for individual and for networks or media networks or working journalist networks, really useful, I feel, in the long run. Perhaps in the short run, they may not be. And I agree, it's all about leadership. And I wanted to share here that we created also, just like Shanette mentioned about ethical guidelines, we created guidelines for the national broadcaster in India, Doordarshan. And our attempt was to encourage gender transformative programming. And in a consultative mode, we created guidelines on the belief that powerful mediums like television can challenge gender stereotypes and inequity in society. These cultural guidelines, these programming guidelines are for creative professionals involved in content development of diverse genres of Doordarshan program. Doordarshan is a national broadcaster. So we conducted, actually, we not only created the guidelines, and this was a success story, which has very rarely happened, but we went to actually 12 different broadcasting stations across India, and each workshop had about 50 people, where we spoke to people. And this was the fun part, to be very frank. As Emily said, these were already, it was great fun talking to experienced working professional to discuss what they understood about gender. And to be very frank, it was very difficult to get through them, to understand our normative lens and the subtle way we reinforce our own biases into programming. The guideline was used as a tool to check this and to enable more gender transformative programs. And I must admit, Alan, that even though we made this, and this happened in 2019, just before COVID, and of course, COVID has really hit everybody and everything is on the back burner right now. But it's all about leadership. So when we started doing this up in Doordarshan, there was a woman head. And she really was very proactive and said, no, I want this to happen, and I want this to be taken up. And she really made all the content producers get up and start reporting institutionally. How should I report? They need to every year create an award for it also. What would be a more gender transformative program and stuff like that. But now when she left, there is a gap. So I admit that it isn't as hunky-dory as we want them to, but at least it's a beginning. And I think it's a very good effort that civil society like us and others in other countries are also making to at least make that push happen.
That makes a lot of sense, that it is about leadership and intention in the news organization. Mm-hmm. Thanks, Vasanti. Nechama, if I may turn to you, our last panelist here. You've written a book on femicide in South Africa. I mean, the quotes are that in South Africa, femicide is 5 times the world average. You also looked, amongst other things, at media data. It wasn't solely about media, to build your case for change in the response by the state to femicide in South Africa. Tell us a little bit about the key findings in your book.
Thanks, Alan. I think I'll just start by saying that compared to some of the previous speakers in the South African landscape, so I teach at Wits, but I've been a journalist for the last 25 years, and that was what really inspired me to use media archives as a way to study violence against women and femicide in particular. But we're quite well represented in some aspects. So I do see in my journalism classes a really strong cohort of young women coming through. We have a number of, not enough, but a number of strong female players in the media industry. And yet when we look at our coverage, we find from studies by organizations like Media Monitoring Africa that women's voices are consistently underrepresented in the press. And when I was researching my doctoral thesis, which in fact was what provided the content for the book that I wrote about femicide in South Africa, one of the things I found was that the journalists who reported the most about femicide were women. And they weren't on the entertainment beat. They were often the court reporters or the crime reporters. And it does suggest quite strongly that there is a link to having more women in the newsroom who are in positions to write about these types of issues and the volume and the type of coverage that these kinds of issues will get. Having said that, so South Africa has one of the highest murder rates in the world and one of the highest rates of femicide in the world. My research showed that less than 20% of femicides that took place in a given year were ever covered in the press. And this creates a very distorted perception in society, or it contributes to a distorted perception of the reality of violence against women. And so I suppose we have to ask the question is, what is the capacity of media to accurately report on violence against women in a society that is so violent? And I think the same would very much apply to the speakers from, I think, most of the other countries that are appearing in this panel. India in particular is the one I'm most familiar with, having worked with other academics there, looking at issues of violence against women in particular. It would be impossible for us as journalists to write about every story, but as academics and training new journalists, how could we approach the issue of violence against women through media in a more responsible, proactive way? Because we know that the majority of people learn about crime and violence from media, even if they experience it in their own lives. The way people understand violence against women is often crafted through what they read in media stories. And if we're not representing these stories accurately, we have a skewed perception. And then we develop faulty strategies based on limited or biased media reporting around the issue. And then our governments kind of put forward faulty strategies, which we support because we don't have the right information to start off with.
I mean, Nechama, have you come across many gender courses aimed at journalists in South Africa? I'm not familiar with too many, but I haven't also surveyed the landscape.
Okay, so this is a great question. In fact, while the first panelists were talking, and you earlier shared a link with us for the UNESCO resource, which I've just shared with one of my colleagues at Wits, because she's looking for resources to help teach the class. And I didn't study journalism as an undergraduate. I did the old-fashioned way, which is you went into a newsroom and let people boss you around for a couple of years before you're allowed to write anything. But no, I've never experienced that level of training. What I do think is interesting is what kind of training do we mean? Because there's gender diversity training, which is maybe one thing. And there we would look at diversity in the newsroom, inter-newsroom kind of socialization and politics. And that's very important because we know from countless studies that increased diversity or improved diversity in the newsroom, in particular, more representation of women, automatically results in a broader diversity of news content. So we have to achieve the one in order to achieve the other, but it's not enough on its own, because putting women into a newsroom where newsrooms historically are socialized around male processes. And I always laugh with my students because they read academic papers. I teach a lot of journalism theory. So they read papers from the 1950s where everything is written about journalists as white men. And the processes and the socialization of a 1950s white male newsroom in the United States is so familiar, even in the 2020s in South Africa. So we have definitely inherited these practices, even though we started to diversify the people who inhabit the newsroom. So that's one question. The second question is, as journalists, what kind of language do we use when we're covering issues of gender? And here I want to kind of maybe separate out gender activism, representation, and diversity from covering issues that affect gender in particular. In South Africa, I think on the one hand, we're quite progressive. So we have, because I also study media archives, I note always how language has transitioned. So we don't talk about prostitutes anymore in the press. We do talk about sex workers. There is a growing acknowledgement that people might have different pronouns and an acceptance of that. We don't use slur words or pejoratives to describe people who are homosexual or who are trans. For the most part, obviously this does still occur, but it's it's no longer the norm, which it very, very much used to be. So on the one level, it looks like our language has improved. When we study issues, so I'm going to go back to femicide again, if we wanted to look at intimate partner violence, there's also been a massive transition where 30, 40 years ago, husbands were never to blame for killing their wives because they snapped, because they'd been provoked, because, well, it was really understandable. They were under a lot of pressure because, women were taking all of their jobs and society was a mess. And to some extent, we've moved away from a very old-fashioned understanding of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. But in many other respects, we haven't. And what I find in the South African context in particular is we've become quite good at covering gender protests, but we haven't become good enough to the same extent at covering the issues that provoke those protests. So we'll be very proactive about covering protests about a prominent femicide victim, but when it comes to the day-to-day media coverage of femicide, we fall short. We use shorthand that doesn't convey the complexity of the situation. And so I think in the South African context, it would be very useful, in addition to having gender training, would be to specifically have gender training about reporting on gender and violence. And I know that in some other countries, this has been done. In the UK, there is a project called, I think it's Dignity for Dead Women. There have been some movements in South America and in Spain where they've provided guidelines, which we hope, but you obviously can't enforce necessarily, for journalists covering violence. Some of those guidelines might include, from the UK example, not describing, when an ex-partner murders his former partner out of jealousy, not calling it a love triangle, or not calling it a love gone wrong. So this, and I do see the same shorthand in South Africa, where those types of killings somehow get represented as a tragic form of romance. And, at our hearts, we have to start asking, why do we keep on allowing fatal violence to be included in our definition as reporters of what constitutes romance? We fictionalized violence to some extent.
Yeah. Can I come in, Alan?
Yes, please do.
Actually, that's a fantastic point that she pointed out. I just wanted to share something very similar that's happening in India, is that in India, we've noticed over the last 10 years, women in media schools and media courses, especially journalism courses, have increased dramatically. In fact, there are more than 60 to 70% who are just women in media schools and journalism schools in India. And there are plenty of them in our country across different sectors, both private and public and government. But what is very interesting is that women enter the field of media, and in terms of the newsroom, all the decision makers are men. Women do come in, and their dropout rate is tremendously higher than men. Most women who enter the media leave after 4 to 5 years of media efforts. And this is happening quite rampantly. We've noticed this trend for quite some time now. And the other point that I wanted to really make was about the entire premise of teaching gender it doesn't exist, at least in Indian media education. It is actually treated just as a women's issue, not a gender issue. And it doesn't establish any linkages with gendered aspects of control, access, inequitable power, and marginalization. And just like the South African colleague talked about it, we do talk about elementary measures to do with language for gender, as gender mainstreaming the whole course, which doesn't actually make, for example, use of neutral phrases, common noun for professionals, gender sensitive language, and avoidance of sexist words. This is all it is limited to. And that's pretty scary actually to think about what our young people are being trained in terms of what they call gender in at least Indian media schools, in spite of being so many being women again.
I was also thinking, Vasanti, when you were talking earlier about the harassment of female journalists. So I've seen that in particular in India and on social media, how women are harassed and targeted. In fact, I mean, I thought South African online trolls can be pretty intense, but it's nothing like what I've encountered when I was working with Indian colleagues. And obviously, I think that creates a very unconducive environment for women to want to continue like that. So if you want to be a journalist and you want to sort of stick your neck out about anything to do with politics, and gender strongly relates back to politics in India, it's incredibly hard. You're going to need a really supportive newsroom and network around you to survive in an incredibly hostile environment. But I also wanted to mention that one of the things for me that's been really useful, in fact, the program that funded part of my PhD, is I was part of a program, I still am, in South Africa called Governing Intimacies, where they have brought together gender scholars, politics scholars, media studies scholars. And while our faculties as a whole might not be intersecting with each other in terms of the training, I think that was another point that Emily made earlier on, was about this limited interaction between departments at universities. And I think that's such a critical point. It would be fantastic if it was faculty-wide rather than just through certain programs. But having said that, it's been a remarkable platform where I was able to engage with scholars in different departments, and they were also able to see the work that I was doing. Because I also think that media is an incredibly important potential resource for researchers who want to look at gender over time, because it creates this really interesting archive that shows us who was important at a different time, and who was given a voice and who wasn't 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, and we can really trace those in interesting ways. I mean, that's my particular interest, obviously. Not everybody likes digging through media archives.
Completely couldn't have actually I agree more with you. In fact, one of my historian colleagues who's a very famous historian in India says that earlier history was written sitting under the trees. Now it's written on television screens, on what we see on a newspaper. And so if we're not archiving it and not studying it or monitoring it or following it, how will the future generation know what history was written and who was it written by, and what was written? So I couldn't agree more with you.
Jeanette, if I may come back to you, I mean, we've been speaking a little bit about the prevalence or the extent to which gender is taught at universities. In Thailand, what's it like there? Do you find gender issues, gender subjects being presented to journalism school students? So your microphone muted.
Okay. Unfortunately, we in Thailand, we might have a problem with gender education for school because there are a lot of gender bias in subject like sex education and the NGO and Thai civil society trying to fight against the education ministry to rewrite or prove about the curriculum that concern that relate to the gender study for the primary school and high school. But for university, Chulalongkorn University, maybe at the, my faculty, the Faculty of Communication Arts, might be claimed as the first faculty in the media study that have launched a gender in media subject in the bachelor degree curriculum since 2000. And for me, I have taught gender in media at the Faculty of Communication Arts, Chulalongkorn University since 2013. And I realized that the way that we have to change gender bias mindset of our students is the key success for gender studies. I'm trying a lot to create a process that give my students the opportunity to step out from their comfort zone. The comfort zone means that they are dominated by patriarchy ideology for a long time, and we want them to change their mindset by this comfort zone or learning zone instead. I have designed my gender class by applying transformative learning. That is the expansion of consciousness through which an individual can question themselves about their own feelings, beliefs, consumptions, and perspective on their purpose. For me, learning by feeling and direct experience about gender and sexuality by the tool of transformative learning is very important. The tool that I always apply to my classroom is deep listening. Deep listening. It's the way that I have taught my students. Deep listening is an almost spiritual skill based on respect people by heart, not by head. I always encourage my students to feel, not to think so much about a gender issue. And when we practice a deep listening, we just listen by heart and suspend all judgments. One activity that I would like to tell you that I have assigned my students to join my classroom by divided them into 4 groups, depend on gender topics, and let them share their own experience on about gender, sexuality, sexual orientation, and gender-based violence. The rule of this activity is just to listen without judgment. This is the way to change mindset of my student by listening. For me, deep listening make the speaker feel safe. And because no one would blame what he said. It is a process of internal, what I call internal empowerment. After this activity, my students reflect so much that they like this activity very much because it's simple, very simple, but it gives my students safe place to communicate about sex. Because in Thailand, we cannot talk too much about sex in the public. So my students feel free to share their own experience about their gender and sexuality by this tool. And they think their mindset about gender and sexuality has been changed by just listening. Yes, that was my experience.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. It sounds like a fascinating methodology for teaching, and you I mean, you make the point that it's gender studies. It's not necessarily about only learning the concepts and the ways to sort of talk about issues, but it's about personal prejudices that you have to try and encourage the students to shift in some way for them to be effective. And it's also a fascinating point that you make, that you can't openly, or it's not normal to openly talk about sex in Thailand, yet you have this kind of rape representation in soap operas. Just a question, are there more male journalists working in Thailand or more female journalists? What is the gender balance like in the newsroom?
Yeah, recently I have do research to survey the proportion of male and female in the media industry. I found that for the practitioner for the level of practitioner, there are female journalists more than male, but unfortunately for the executive board, the balance of male and female is imbalanced. There are more executive male journalists in the board than a female. That is a gap between the proportion male and female in Thailand, in media organization in Thailand. Yes.
Thank you. I would like to, Emily, I'd like to turn to you, and Emily has sent me a note that she has a very profound webinar complication. Her battery is running flat. So I hope we don't lose Emily in between before this end of this webinar. Emily, a question for you. You've been working with the Uganda Media Women's Association. You've done research on gender-based violence there. And in fact, you used the second resource, which is on reporting against violence against women and girls, as an input into this process. Just tell us a little bit about that and how useful you found the resource for those who haven't yet looked at it.
Oh, thank you, Alan. I also hope that I will not run out of my battery before the end of the webinar. But yes, we've done a lot of research. I sit on the board of Uganda Media Women's Association as their vice chairperson. So I have been engaged with them for many years, and I've done also research for them in terms of content analysis of gender coverage in our newspapers, our major newspapers here. And what we found at the last, I think in 2019 was the last one I did, the last content analysis or media monitoring, if you like, showed that much of the reporting on gender-based violence was really event-based, so-and-so was killed, and there was this, there was that, but no follow-up stories. And sometimes up to 5 people are killed, and sometimes it's really gross, but no follow-up is really done on those stories. So Uganda Media Women's Association then went ahead to apply to UN Women to try and train journalists, on how to report about gender-based violence. And so I started by doing a needs assessment among journalists to try and appreciate the knowledge gap, the skills gap, and the attitudes of these journalists, those who are already practicing in the field, who have been really working on gender-based reporting. So like somebody mentioned, we also wanted it not just to be about women, it should be more a gender issue than a women's issue. So as Uganda Women's Association, we've been involved in not just training journalists, but also, coming up with guidelines for journalists to use. We've created some gender sensitive reporting guidelines. We have trained journalists in the newsroom and even their editors. We have created some kind of ethical code, a kind of one-pager that you can put in the newsroom as a reminder of what the general issues are. So we've not been resting. We've been doing little bits and pieces of things. So in the last one, when I did the training needs assessment, we discovered that the knowledge gap was really huge. As I said earlier, simple things like just understanding the concepts. It might seem like the concepts themselves are not enough. I mean, are enough, but even those concepts are hardly understood by many of the journalists. So we created a guideline in terms of being structured. We wanted, if we're training journalists across the country, how can we actually be structured? How can we make sure that journalists have a basic and simple understanding of what their reporting needs are? What language do they use? How do they interview victims? And or even how the language between victims and survivors and so on. So we created a resource that in the process, I came across this UNESCO resource, and I was really amazed by its simplicity, the fact that I found that it was not necessary to reinvent the wheel, especially in terms of defining the concepts. And in our training of journalists, the master's one that I told you about, we really approach it from a very theoretical point of view. Remember, this is a master's class, and so we anchor it in social justice. We teach theories around social justice, the role of media in covering social justice, in at least promoting social justice, gender equality and women's rights and so on, the international, regional and national legal frameworks and so on. But for this particular training, we recognize that context matters. And so we crafted the material to the extent that if you're training journalists in a certain context, say Western region, they have their own norms and stereotypes about gender, their own myths and truths about gender-based violence. And so we draw on some of those and make sure that we appreciate what their issues are and come up with some basic, allow them to come up with some basic do's and don'ts in reporting and then also give them some of the code of ethics issues. We try as much as possible to help them understand that it's an ethical reporting issue. It's not just a gender issue, but also it's an ethical reporting issue that you're actually required to report ethically, to respect privacy, to treat your subjects in a respectful manner. So we go through all of that. And we have found that it's really helpful. A lot of journalists eventually who have gone through the training tell us that, I used to think this way, and their perceptions are shifting. They're shifting their thinking around gender, they're thinking around violence against women, they're thinking around the role that they as journalists can actually play in terms of fair reporting, in terms of also calling on duty bearers on what these people should actually do, in terms of accountability, demanding accountability from those who should protect the victims of violence, as we have seen. So we found it extremely useful in terms of, but we also realize that it's a never-ending kind of activity. You can't just stop training. You have to keep reminding people, because people are socialized to think about these things in a certain way. And it takes time for them to actually change their attitude. But what's important is to expose them to some of the real issues. And some of them are not necessarily conscious when they report the way they do, when they use the language they do. So a bit of reminder in the training we have found has become very useful. And we've been doing that for a long time.
I mean, Emily, there was a comment in the chat, and I think it's more to do with the sort of structures of patriarchy, but around, they say, Emily, that you spoke about the identity being subsumed by taking a husband's surname.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, would you like to respond
I saw
to
that, and I need to address that. I think the problem is not that it's a bad thing to use a husband's name or a mother's name or anything. And the point I was making is that the media sometimes, when it comes to women, will want to emphasize the fact that you are so-and-so's wife, rather than being your person as the leader that you are. It's very rare that you're going to be talking about the achievements of a male leader and you're insisting on referring to them as the wife, the husband of so-and-so. And those are some of the things that we are making reference to, that there are double standards in terms of, representing women and men in leadership. The women are most likely to be referred to as being protected by their husbands, or if their husband is a popular person, then the reference is often made about Emily, the wife of so-and-so. But I am a professional in my own right. Why can't the media, if they find me a worthy source, talk about the things I'm doing without necessarily linking my success to my husband. Even though I might choose to use my husband's name, that's a good thing. It's my choice, but it should not be as if I am an appendage of my husband. I think that's what the media often tries to do in terms of reporting. There's absolutely nothing wrong with using a husband's name or whoever person's name you choose to use, but to what extent does it translate to the identity of the women we are talking about, especially in leadership?
Thank you. Nechama, if I may turn back to you, there's a statement here, the point here around, I think gender-based violence reporting has been hinged more on women and children while men are left out. I'm not quite sure if the commenter means left out of the role of kind of gender, of reaching sort of gender equality net, or men as victims of gender-based violence. Your comment on that, because of course we know that there is, men also get raped, we know that's underreported too. How does that fit into the picture, do you feel, around producing a more gender equal, better representation of women in the media?
I think there's a number of aspects we have to consider. First, that men in general are the primary perpetrators and also the primary victims of violence in every country around the world. Women tend to make up a smaller proportion of the victims of violence, but they're usually victims in different contexts and different situations and for different reasons than men. We also know that when it comes to fatal violence, the majority of women are killed by their intimate partners, and this is a global phenomenon. So in every single country, the primary risk to women of violence and of fatal violence is in fact the person she shares a house with, or has formerly shared a house with, or has rejected as a love interest or something like that. So I think that I have noticed, again, this isn't a new question. We often see men in the comments section or at workshops, at seminars, sticking their hands up and saying, but what about the men? And I must say, frankly, as a scholar of media history and as a feminist and as a scholar of gender studies and really somebody who studies violence against men and women, men have been overrepresented in media since the start of media, and in fact, since the start of society. And it's incredibly important that we see women and children being represented in media, not just as journalists, but also we understand the victims as people in their own right. And I think that was an important point that Emily was making. This isn't about some level of political correctness, even if you want to put it like that. It's understanding that women are humans and have human rights and have rights as individuals. And this was in fact critical to the work that was done with the United Nations conferences for women over many years, was acknowledging, it took about 20 years to reach this point, that violence against women was in fact a human rights issue. So having said that, I will say in the South African context that men who are victims of violence are underrepresented in the press, simply again because we have so much male violence. However, looking at media reports, particularly of violence against women, what we tend to see is, in so many cases, also because the women are dead and can no longer speak for themselves, that women don't have voices, even once they've been murdered. And so often the way violence is described is through official sources, the police, through the judiciary, through the government officials, who inevitably also tend to be men because of the way our societies are structured. So the narration of even violence against women is still a story told by men, which when you think about it is a bit ridiculous. It's about us, it's almost like asking a man to describe what childbirth feels like. Is that we absolutely have to narrate the stories of women using the voices of women. And perhaps one of the ways, in fact, not perhaps, we know that one of the ways to achieve this is, for example, by pushing for more female voices in our expert sources. And this is a proactive step that anybody can take. But if we look, for one of my favorite examples of this is an American journalist called Ed Yong, who's a science writer for The Atlantic. And he made he set himself an agenda, particularly, I think it was a year or two ago before the pandemic, to increase the number of female voices he included as sources. Now, I know, for example, in South Africa, Media Monitoring Africa did a survey where they found that even around COVID, 80% of the sources being used were male. and only 20% of the sources being used were female. That changes how we read a story. So for the ones who are worried that men are being left out, I can tell you empirically that it is not the case. And what we need to do, and what we also need to include in our teaching of journalists and future journalists, is we need to include more expert female sources in order to even out the voice, also so that women's voices don't only come across as victims.
I mean, you reminded me that there's a project, Quote This Woman, in South Africa that monitors the women sources and also provides expert reference points for the journalists, which I think is an amazing and practical initiative to get more women experts and commentators in the media. Versant, I saw you agreeing with Nechama when she was talking. Perhaps a final comment from you, because we are running out of time at this point.
Yeah,
your
okay.
mic is
I just, the only small point that I wanted to add to her was that when we were doing the study with media on violence against women journalists, men were also protesting, saying, how come you're not talking about us? And the same thing that she just explained was right. There is violence against journalists per se. Women do not talk about it, do not voice their opinion, and somehow they just try to keep, because it's that stigma, it's that harassment, the trauma the family and the person goes through, that they keep quiet about it. Men generally talk about it, and therefore we know journalists are being attacked and affected. But women journalists, who especially online, they just keep quiet, they don't even respond, even peers don't respond. So there is a need to be able to bring these up to light, and very rightly so. And in fact, if you think this is the final comment that I really want to add further to that, Alan, I feel that media professionals who go through journalism education should be primed to look at discrimination, violence, and biases based on gender with very sensitive approach, since they are really placed appropriately in counterbalancing the existing gender hierarchies in the society. And gender mainstreaming is a very important for countries like ours, India, where the sex ratio amplifies the gender inequity in social, not just political and economic sphere. It's ingrained in our culture and society. Clearly, this is not just about changing the curriculum alone, as all my colleagues have said the same, but developing a structural policy and more a programmatic actions for an integrative approach process of gender mainstreaming, leading to transformative changes in journalism education. That's what I wanted to actually communicate in this particular session, at least.
Well, thank you. I would like to, we do have run out of time, and I think this has been a fascinating discussion. So I would like to thank all four guests, Nechama Brody, Versanti Rao, Emily Comfort Marakto, and Shanette Tinam for your time. And to thank the guests for joining, the participants for joining us for this webinar. Thank you, and we'll be in touch soon, I'm sure, in various forums. So thank you very much for your time, and good afternoon and good night.
Thank you so much. Great to see
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.